Please ignore or disregard my background. I'm in a temporary slash in between living space, so it's a little bit hard. I still wanted to make this video anyways, because every time something comes up to my mind, I just want to make a video. And as I'm sure some of you know, I'm not a marketer, so it's really hard for us scientists slash researchers to put ourselves out there making these videos. Like, we don't know which equipment to buy and how to talk and how to entertain you guys, so it ends up being pretty boring and stale, and so as a result it's not as dramatic and exciting, although the topic is, and so it becomes a little bit not your typical video. So I hope you bear with me. Two quick topics I wanted to discuss today, and one is a quick result regarding the experiment I did with electrifying the prefrontal lobe, and secondly, I want to talk about how computational neuroscience is changing everything and how everyone basically can get involved and become more or less, at least contribute to the world of science if you're interested, because it's becoming less and less dependent on all the college degrees you may have, as long as you're interested in the computational part of it, meaning to say programming, writing codes. And it's not as scary and as it might sound. It sounds more intimidating than it actually is. So about the first topic and the experiment that I ran on myself, it lasted more or less 10 days, but I had to stop because it kind of felt a little bit as if I was overdoing it, because I was doing it every day, every morning, more specifically. And what I did was that I changed different level of the current that I exerted on my prefrontal lobe by putting those sponges that basically added an extra layer of electricity to the prefrontal lobe. But nonetheless, I did feel a lot of difference in me, not only about some decisions that I had to make, which I was, I think, thinking about them a little bit too much, sort of overthinking things, but it also kind of made me feel a little bit different in that I felt a little bit more empowered. Again, this is not a scientific experiment, meaning to say it's only one participant, which is me, and also obviously there's a lot of factoring involved. Now, as a researcher slash scientist, I am trained to be as objective as possible, even when more specifically when I run studies. So in that sense, I was able to be more objective and critical thinking, if you will, than when I was not a scientist. So I wouldn't really want to say that it has a lot of sugar pill effect, if you will. In fact, I feel like I was quite objective in the results. In examining the results, I should say, to objective enough to see the difference and to identify those differences. So the quick summary is that I feel like it had a positive impact on me, and the fact that I wanted to feel a little bit more empowered, and both within myself, within the work that I'm doing, but also some of the decisions that I had to make. So it did actually have that impact on me, objectively speaking. So I do want to continue doing that in the future. I just had to do a mini pause because I started feeling like I was overdoing it, and I tend to want to listen to what my body tells me, because I'm kind of quite familiar in those signals that it gives me. So overall, it was a great experience. I highly recommend it if you're Another topic I wanted to talk about is the fact that I see more and more in the field of sciences that with the emerging technologies that we have, science is no longer for those special type of people who were either extremely smart or they were elite or they had a lot of privileges. In fact, the emerging technology, more specifically some specific coding languages like Python, for example, has increasingly made it easier for us individuals to get involved, even though we do not have your typical special background, if you will, that scientists had to have 100 years ago, for example. And so today, if anybody wants to embark on doing anything scientific, he or she is able to do that because of all these technologies that we have at our hands. And one of them is computational neuroscience. So the difference between computational neuroscience and your traditional experimental neuroscience is that with computational science, you actually don't need to be in the lab having human or animal participants and conduct experiment on them, writing the experimental design, etc. You actually don't need that. All you need is those specific models, for example, computational models that are mostly extracted from your traditional mathematics. And obviously you need a computer, a laptop, and also you need specific coding languages like Python, which is for free. You can create those environments within your laptop. Google has a bunch of them, of course, and other platforms as well, and it's really not hard to learn. You do need to, however, be a little bit familiar with coding and with writing codes, I should say, as well as some mathematics. But other than that, you really don't need to be a full-fledged neuroscientist. In fact, the summer class that I took at Neuromatch, the class that I was assigned to, half of them were not neuroscientists. They were actually engineers who were interested in neuroscience. So it's not as traditional as we used to have when it comes to getting into the field of cognitive sciences. And I frankly think that whoever is interested need to get into the field, because we are now at an age in our history that we've never been before. And with the rising of AI, for example, most of AI is written in Python. The field emergence of neuroscience, AI, robotic, etc., is just inevitable, and it's just part of it. And we need people who can add value to that. And by just, for example, learning about these computational neuroscience, these models, anybody can conduct those experiments. And the way you conduct those experiments is that you can either, for example, collaborate with an experimental neuroscientist who actually has those raw data that they go into the lab and they collect, for example, from human participants or from animals. Unfortunately, but that's part of the science world as well. Unfortunately, I've never done animals, by the way. I just did human research. But so you can either collaborate with those scientists, gather their data, and then do computational neuroscience on that data, on that raw data. For example, writing different models and running them and see what the outcome is, and based on that, come up with findings, for example, research findings, writing papers, etc. Or you actually don't need raw data. You can just use those models, those computational models, and then based on that, basically claim that, okay, if we were to have a data like this, because we've seen that in the past, then I'm stimulating the data. So you can actually use a Python and stimulate the data. In other words, pretend that the data, you have the data, and then based on that, do the computational neuroscience, depending on what it is that you want to compute. And the way you can stimulate that data is based on the data that we've had in the past. And a lot of these data is actually about the neurons. We call it the spike of the neurons. Essentially what it is that the neuron is either on and off. And when it's on, basically we say there is a spike, and you can basically calculate on those spikes. So as you can see, it's not as exclusive as it was before, and that's part of the reason I love the new emerging, more modern science as opposed to the traditional ones. Because if you look back to the traditional neuroscience, they were all men, first and foremost. They were all white and they were all old. And by the time they turn into like 60 or 70, that's the only time that they would be considered as, eligible, legitimate scientists, and that's when people actually would listen to them. And they all had these sort of secretive labs that they would go to, and it was were all very secretive. And then they would have their own secret clubs that they would meet. And I mean, look at the history, Freud's Freudian history. It was like 100 years ago. But the emerging and the more modern science that we are in the verge of entering now looks very different. So unless you're within those sort of younger scientific communities, you won't see it. You still see your textbook sort of old version of neuroscience and cognitive sciences. But in this new type of movement, those scientists look very different. They are not as exclusive as this, as they were 100 years ago. But also the emerging technology make it so that basically whoever is interested and chooses not to sit in front of TV and just watch stuff for like hours, instead go and write codes and do something, it's very inclusive. But unfortunately, most of the people that you see, it doesn't matter where in the world you are, humanity in general, they're mostly much more interested into just having a life and just live it day to day and do your normal things, which is, of course you have to have a house, you have to have a family and things like that. But most of them, that's basically all their lives is about. Whereas those who choose to do science, they just can't live like that forever, because at one point their passion takes over. And those are very few. There are fewer people who think scientifically than the ones who think not. And so, for example, for those of us who are interested in that, this passion of ours and this sort of science and studies that we do, it just becomes something that just we cannot live without. So, for example, for me, it really feels like the air. For me, it's that important to me day to day. And believe me, I have tried to forget it. For years, I tried to put it in a closet and not just think about it, but it just keeps popping out. And so there is a time that you just give in and you're like, okay, this is going to be my life. And I need to do all the sacrifices. And one of the reasons you actually a lot of times don't want to pursue it is because you have to make a lot of sacrifices. Your social life suffers and your relationship and things like that. And so if you are one of those people who are very interested but never had the opportunity to do something about it, What I'm trying to say is that rest assured, we are not living in the old scientific communities anymore. In fact, we are much more enabled now than we ever were before. And you really don't need to worry about the fact that you don't have the background, or maybe you don't have the money to go to these fancy schools, or you don't have the equipment. Basically, what you can do, if you have a laptop and you're interested in, for example, learning a little bit of a programming language, you can just teach yourself Python for free. There are courses everywhere, and there are a lot of blogs. And once you learn a little bit Python, the computational neuroscience models that also they're available freely. That people write about it, talk about it, etc. And then you can just sort of teach yourself, and then maybe take classes here and there if you have money and you just want to sort of add to your body of knowledge. But based on that, you're really empowered with practically nothing to create your own scientific experiment by just stimulating data, writing codes, and just making the argument that, okay, I did this, I took this, stimulation of data and used this computational mathematical computations, and here is what I'm proposing in terms of, if you want to write, for example, a paper, or you can just blog about it. Obviously, if you want to write a scientific peer-reviewed paper, you won't be able to do it like that, because that's like a whole different animal. It's just very it's very political, and even those of us who are scientists, kind of a lot of us have given up on that because of all the politics. Nonetheless, you can still use social media to talk about it, or if you just want to keep it secret for a while, you can just do it for yourself. It won't be like a scientific paper, but at least you are contributing to something when it comes to the body of knowledge. Regardless, if I just talk from my own point of view, my life feels much more worth living when I do anything scientific related, as opposed to if I were to just live my life day in, day out, just go to work and then go on social media, start complaining about everything else, everybody else, and blame it on others, and just basically not producing anything. Because the way I see it, there are two types of people: the producers and the consumers. Producers are the ones who actually do something. They have produced something, like I read about Jack Dorsey the other day, that he stepped down as a CEO, and a lot of people on Twitter were just saying, oh, F you, I'm glad you stepped down, and things like that. And I was thinking, well, the guy actually was one of the very few who contributed, who produced something in this world that, whether you like it or not, it's still at least a production. It's something that added value to a lot of people's lives.